Welcome back. When President Trump fired his third national security advisor this week, the hawkish John Bolton, one Republican who was not at all happy was Congresswoman Liz Cheney of Wyoming. She had a sharp Twitter exchange with Senator Rand Paul of Kentucky, who cheered Bolton's departure, tweeting that Paul was, quote, a big loser, whose motto seems to be terrorists first and America second. Cheney has been at least as tough on Democrats, and she's considering a run for the Senate seat that's being vacated by Republican Mike Enzi next year in Wyoming. And Congresswoman Liz Cheney, the number 3 Republican in the House, joins me now from Rock Springs, Wyoming. Congresswoman, welcome back to Meet the Press.
Thanks very much, Chet. Great to be with you.
Let me start with sort of a 30,000-foot look at the world right now. India and Pakistan are warning of a nuclear confrontation over Kashmir. Turkey is poised to choose Russia over NATO, which had joined almost 70 years ago. And Japan and South Korea are in a trade war and have terminated their intelligence sharing pact. These are allies I'm speaking of here. Do you feel as if the globe is more stable with President Trump as commander-in-chief now than it was 3 years ago?
Oh, absolutely. There's no question. When you look at the situation that President Trump inherited when he came into office, when you look at what we had seen happen, for example, across Iraq and Syria when President Obama withdrew precipitously based on a political timetable, we had the rise of the caliphate, we had the rise of ISIS. President Trump's decision-making and leadership changed that. One of the most important things this president has done is dedicate the resources necessary to begin rebuilding our Defense Department, rebuilding our military. Under Barack Obama, you had 8 years where our military did not get the resources it needed, while our adversaries built, deployed, and in some cases now have weapon systems that we cannot defend against. So there's no question but that the world is safer, that we're in a situation where American leadership has come back, and it's important that we continue down that path.
If American leadership has come back, then why are India and Pakistan closer to in a hot war than they were before? Why is Japan and South Korea? I mean, that would be a situation, frankly, that I don't think any previous president would have allowed to the way it has festered. That's the type of things that you would wonder if maybe that's why we've had so much trouble keeping a national security advisor. Does none of this trouble you?
Look, first of all, with respect to Ambassador Bolton, you know, Ambassador Bolton has served his nation honorably in a number of positions, but this president, any president, has the right to have the people around him he decides. The only people who are elected in the West Wing are the president and the vice president. And everybody else's staff, they serve at the pleasure of the president, the same with all the cabinet officials. So I think that's very important to point out. Secondly, I would say there is no question but that the world is a very dangerous place, that America faces a very grave and complicated global threat environment. I think it's more dangerous than at any time since the end of World War II. But the way in which we are responding to that, the way in which we're dealing with it, the extent to which, for example, President Trump has been willing to walk away from dangerous deals. When he came into office, the United States was a party to the Iran nuclear accords. The United States was a party to the INF Treaty. Both of those agreements were agreements that made us less safe. The INF Treaty only restricted the United States because the Russians cheated, and it didn't restrict the Chinese. The JCPOA, as we now know, the Iranians have continued to cheat, will continue to cheat, and then, of course, we saw this horrific attack yesterday on the Saudi oil facilities.
I'm curious, what should be our response to that in particular? And I say this because, do you believe this came from Yemen, or do you believe this was, and if it was Iranian inspired or Iranian directed, or the Iranians did it? Where are you on this?
Look, I think Secretary Pompeo's statements yesterday were absolutely right. I think it's very clear this was the Iranians.
Do we need to provide proof?
It's a very significant escalation, and I would say we ought to do several things. First of all, I would say we should deny the visa the Iranian delegates who are planning to come into the United States, come to New York next week for the UN General Assembly meetings.
The president,
the Iranians, as Secretary,
the foreign minister, every one of them.
The Iranians, absolutely. Absolutely. Secondly, I think as her first step as our new UN ambassador, Kelly Craft, who's a terrific new UN ambassador, ought to offer a resolution for snapback sanctions, to say, listen, it's very clear the Iranians, because of a number of things we've seen recently, including the secret warehouse that the Israelis found and revealed, where it's clear that they have now begun and continued their enrichment activities, expanded their enrichment activities. They're operating in total violation of the Iranian nuclear deal, and we ought to have those sanctions snapped back. I think that, you know, when you have entities like the Iranians, like the Taliban, who continue to attack American interests, as the Iranians are doing, who continue to kill Americans, as we've seen in the case of both the IRGC as well as the Taliban and their ally Al-Qaeda. It's very important for us to send the message, you have to choose. You can either do diplomacy or you can attack America and attack our interests. But we know you're not serious about diplomacy if you continue to have the kinds of attacks we've seen over the last few days. You know?
All right. The fact that you want to make sure they don't even get visas to attend the UN, I know where you are on my next question, which is the idea of the president sitting down and talking with the Iranians. That is, it appears that the reason for the split between Mr. Bolton and Mr. Trump was over the idea of easing some sanctions in order to begin some talks with the Iranians. Do you think it's a mistake to talk to the Iranians on any level?
I think it would not be the right approach now, particularly in the aftermath of the attacks that we saw in the Saudi oil facilities. I think that we've got a maximum pressure campaign on the Iranians that this administration has put in place that is absolutely working. And that be about right now is making sure the Iranians understand that they're isolated.
How is it working if they're making...
will not abide by this kind of activity?
Sorry, I hate interrupting over a satellite because it can sound ruder than it's intended to be, but the Iranians are still now they're trying to make nuclear weapons. They're trying to do things faster. How has maximum pressure worked if it's accelerating their efforts to get a nuclear weapon?
But the Iranians have very clearly been feeling the huge brunt of these sanctions. And I think that it's important for us to make sure they understand that they cannot have a nuclear weapon, that the world will stand against that, that they cannot, you know, when we were part of the Iranian nuclear agreement, the Iranians were doing all these things. There were no serious, real verification measures in that agreement. Remember, Chuck, the Iranians they didn't have to reveal any of their past nuclear activity. They were even able to verify themselves at their military sites. So what we know about what they've been doing, we know in part because of what the Israelis have done from an intelligence perspective. But the Iranians have continued to foment and support terrorism across the globe. They've continued their ballistic missile development. They're in a position where these sanctions now that this president and this administration have put on are biting, they're hurting, they're feeling it. The people of Iran, you're seeing increasingly the people of Iran saying, listen, we don't want part of this. We don't want to be a pariah state. And the Iranians ought to understand and recognize we're not going to abide by an Iranian nuclear weapon. We're not going to allow that to happen. And they need to come back to the table to negotiate. These sanctions will continue to be strengthened. They'll continue to feel increasing pressure until they do that. But we're not in the business of doing what Barack Obama did, where he sent pallets full of cash, for example, to the Iranians to bribe them to come to the negotiating table.
Well, it does sound like that you're speaking more stridently on this than President Trump is. He does seem to be open to this.
You know, you may want to say that, but I think if you look at the way this president has operated, you look at the extent to which he was willing to walk away from this agreement, you look at Secretary Pompeo's statements from yesterday, I think particularly now in the aftermath of this attack, we have to be absolutely clear that the Iranians are isolated, and we're going to build an international coalition of support for putting back the sanctions that ought to be in place against them.
All right, let me ask about this Rand Paul business. And let me ask you to respond to the to it this way. Washington Examiner headline, Liz Cheney slimes Rand Paul as supporting terrorists because he opposes war. And essentially, it's criticizing you, the writer's criticizing you for basically saying she should engage with Senator Paul on the merits of his ideas, not slander him as pro-terrorism. It's using the words calling somebody pro-terrorist. Do you admit that that's probably a little overboard?
Look, I think if you look back at what Senator Paul has said over many, many years, he's very different from where President Trump is on these issues. President Trump puts America first. Senator Paul, whenever given the opportunity, blames America first. If you look at what he said about, why we were attacked on 9/11, if you look at what he said, he's blamed America even for World War II. President Trump doesn't believe that. Senator Paul does. And look, I think fundamentally at the end of the day, this is about substance and policy. And Senator Paul tried to get elected president. He was able to get only less than 5% of the vote in the Iowa caucuses, as you well know. His views are not views that are shared widely, certainly among Republicans and among the American people as a whole. And they're dangerous views as well.
Are you running for the Senate?
Pardon me?
Are you running for the Senate?
I have not got any announcements to make this morning, Chuck, but I'll be sure to let you know.
Well, that sounds like a thinking about it. As we go, Congresswoman Liz Cheney, thank you for joining us this morning and sharing your views. I appreciate it.